Olá, boa noite. O Roda Viva está no ar para todo o Brasil, pela TV Cultura e emissoras afiliadas. E em múltiplas telas em todo o mundo, com transmissão pelo UOL e pelas nossas plataformas digitais. Há muito tempo, a emergência climática já deveria ter deixado de ser tema de cúpulas para se tornar uma preocupação e um compromisso diários de todos nós, seres humanos. A rápida elevação da temperatura da Terra é uma realidade cotidiana, cujos efeitos já são sentidos em todo o planeta. No próximo dia 31, começa outra dessas cúpulas. A COP26, 26ª Conferência da ONU para o Clima, acontece em Glasgow, na Escócia, e vai reunir os principais chefes de Estado do mundo para discutir a necessidade de se antecipar compromissos e, sobretudo, tirá-los do papel. A nossa entrevistada desta noite é uma das maiores autoridades mundiais em justiça climática, conceito que analisa os efeitos desiguais da crise climática sobre os mais pobres. O seu livro sobre o tema, esse aqui, acaba de ser lançado no Brasil pela Civilização Brasileira. Nele, ela diz que a pandemia de Covid-19 é apenas o trailer de um filme que a humanidade já começa a viver por conta da emergência climática. Para falar sobre o que precisa ser feito para que este filme não tenha um final trágico, está no centro virtual do Roda Viva a ex-presidente da Irlanda e ex-alta comissária da ONU para o Clima, Mary Robinson.
Com uma longa trajetória em defesa do meio ambiente, ela criou a fundação que leva seu nome, Mary Robinson, dedicada à proteção das populações de áreas ameaçadas pelas mudanças climáticas. Os direitos humanos e a luta contra o racismo são outras frentes de seu trabalho que lhe valeram prêmios e o reconhecimento internacional. Atualmente preside o grupo The Elders, organização internacional que reúne ex-presidentes e ex-primeiros ministros dedicados à busca de soluções para problemas mundiais como o aquecimento global e as pandemias.
Para entrevistar a Mary Robinson, nós convidamos Cristina Serra, colunista da Folha de São Paulo, Renata Machado Tupinambá, jornalista, roteirista e fundadora da produtora indígena Originárias Produções, Leonardo Sakamoto, colunista do portal UOL, Giovana Girardi, jornalista especializada na cobertura de ciência e meio ambiente, e Cláudio Ângelo, coordenador de comunicação do Observatório do Clima. Contamos ainda com os desenhos do nosso querido Paulo Caruso. Boa noite, presidente Robinson. Obrigada por estar conosco aqui nesta noite. Eu queria começar perguntando à senhora acerca da COP26. O que a gente pode ter de expectativa quanto a compromissos que tirem do papel as principais metas do Acordo de Paris e o quão atrasados nós estamos para começar a efetivar essas mudanças, para que a mudança climática não nos atinja ainda mais fortemente?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you and the journalists on the panel and to have a focus on climate justice. But I want to answer your question about COP26. It's the most important COP, certainly since Paris, maybe even more than Paris, because we're running out of time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, made a report in October 2018 that said the whole world needs to stay at or below 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial standards. And that means cutting fossil fuel emissions by 45% by 2030. That's 9 years away. And a recent synthesis report of the UN said that instead of cutting, we will see them rise on the current business as usual. It would rise by 16%. So COP26 has to align us with the 1.5 degrees. We won't close that gap immediately, I think, in COP. That would be too difficult. But we have to have the commitments and the urgency that aligns us to 1.5. We're not there yet. The G20 at the end of this month in Rome, just before the COP in Glasgow, will be extremely important. And of course, Brazil is one of the countries that has not been ambitious about its nationally determined contribution and needs to increase its ambition.
Perfeito, muito obrigada. Por favor, Leonardo.
Presidente Robinson, antes de mais nada, saudações. Na introdução do seu livro, na edição brasileira da introdução do seu livro Justiça Climática, a senhora afirma que a crise global da Covid-19 trouxe valiosas lições para o enfrentamento da crise climática, da crise ambiental. A senhora disse que governança, ciência e compaixão são fundamentais. Infelizmente, esse tripé foi atacado pelo governo do presidente Jair Bolsonaro no Brasil, tanto na crise da Covid-19 quanto na nossa crise ambiental. Em ambos os casos, houve sabotagem, ataque a cientistas e desdém pela vida. Como resultado, temos 605 mil mortos e uma disparada nas taxas de desmatamento. Diante disso, o que uma sociedade pode fazer quando o seu próprio governo depõe contra o futuro?
I must say I am very concerned and I feel for the ordinary people of Brazil when they have bad government at this point in time. First of all, as you said, during COVID, to see so many deaths in Brazil, it is so sad and shocking and so terrible. It shouldn't have happened. If the President Bolsonaro had listened to the scientists, and that's what governments should and must do. COVID has taught us those lessons, that the governments that have listened to the science and taken steps to, first of all, have protocols of social distancing, wearing masks, being careful, washing hands, etc., and then rolling out the vaccines. They have, they've promoted their people because they have prevented death, they've prevented illness, and their economy is recovering more quickly. It's very clear to see. I know there is great criticism of the president in Brazil at the moment, and there should be. And similarly with the climate problem, both the lack of ambition about emissions and what's happening to the Amazon. The Amazon, it's very precious to Brazil, but it's very precious and necessary to the world as well. And very precious, I know, to indigenous peoples.
Obrigada. Cristina, por favor.
Boa noite, presidente Robinson. Saudações. Eu gostaria de aprofundar um pouco mais sobre as expectativas em relação à participação do Brasil na Conferência de Glasgow. A contribuição mais importante que o Brasil pode dar para controlar as emissões de carbono é justamente controlar o desmatamento. Mas aqui no Brasil o que a gente vê é até uma certa política de estímulo ao desmatamento, estímulo às atividades predatórias, sobretudo na Amazônia. Então a minha pergunta é, o que esperar do Brasil em termos de compromissos, de metas na Conferência de Glasgow? E, bem objetivamente, o Brasil é um parceiro confiável nas negociações para controlar as emissões de carbono?
It's sad that we have to have a panel discussion about a country that's not living up to its commitments made earlier and the commitments on stopping deforestation that were made in the summit before Paris and at Paris. And, the really sad thing is, and you know it much better than I do, that under this current president, Brazil has been going backwards. Brazil had a very good Minister of Environment at Paris, a good friend, and also now a friend of COP with me. We were in a larger circle as friends of COP, Isabella. But at the moment, I'm afraid it's going to have to be business that's on the right side of this issue. And there are more and more businesses that are saying we're going to be zero carbon by 2050, and we're taking steps that comply with science to get there. Not all of them at all, but a number. And civil society. We have to have such a movement of civil society, and I hope that there will be very, very strong voices at COP26. I will be there. I will be speaking out. I'm an elder. I will not be nice and diplomatic, but I also want to give hope. People must have hope that we are going to be able to align with 1.5, and that's a political decision. The first political decision is going to be at the COP20, the G20 in Rome that I mentioned, and we'll have to see how countries will raise their ambition there. I fear it won't be nearly enough to totally align us with 1.5. So at the conference, we're going to have some mechanism of accountability. It may be that it has to come from wider civil society, from means of mapping and seeing what countries are doing and knowing how big the gap is. And the reports that the UN does, like yesterday, the UN Environment Programme's productivity gap report is truly shocking. It's showing that companies are, planning to increase their oil and gas and coal, not quite to the same extent, but still increase, instead of cutting coal completely and getting out of oil and gas as fast as possible. I mean, it's actually shocking.
Giovana, por favor, sua pergunta.
Olá, presidente Robson, obrigada por estar aqui com a gente. Eu queria insistir nessa questão sobre os humores, os ânimos para essa COP26. A senhora era a enviada especial da ONU para as mudanças climáticas em Paris, quando foi fechado o acordo, e havia naquele momento uma mobilização muito grande, né? Os ânimos naquele momento eram muito proativos para que se houvesse um acordo. E de lá para cá muita coisa mudou. Teve Trump, teve Bolsonaro, como a gente está aqui falando. A senhora mencionou, né, que o Brasil não está disposto a cumprir o que prometeu, mas eu imagino que outros países também estejam nessa mesma toada. A senhora sente que nesse momento que a senhora disse que é uma conferência ainda mais importante talvez do que Paris, há o ânimo necessário que havia em Paris para que agora se alcance essas ambições maiores que são desejadas e necessárias?
Well, before COP, I remember this because, as you said, I was the special envoy of the UN Secretary-General. I saw a lot of nervousness. The French presidency were not sure that we would have a good COP. They were very pleased that China and the United States did say, we see that we need a Paris climate agreement. But what was the problem was we couldn't get agreement on committing to a goal that included staying at 1.5. That was a key thing, and it was very interesting how it happened, and it only happened at Paris itself. India, for example, wouldn't agree before Paris. No way, even days before Paris, and there were others who didn't want to agree either. So it was the small island states, especially under the foreign minister at the time of the Marshall Islands, Tony de Bruym. We worked closely together. He was a good friend, and he was a very good voice in the ministerial meetings before Paris. And he kept saying, do you want my country to disappear and go under because of sea level rise? Do you want us to no longer be a sovereign people, just a group of people, migrants in another country? And he kept repeating this. And then we had the marching in Paris in the street, 1.5 to stay alive. And in Paris, a high ambition coalition was formed in Paris during the conference. And the high ambition coalition was led by Tony de Bruym of the Marshall Islands, but it included the United States and the European Union and a wide range of countries. And the whole purpose of the High Ambition Coalition was to get 1.5 degrees into the text. And we did. You remember the goal of Paris, very clear, that we would stay well below 2 degrees of warming and work for 1.5 degrees. And then Paris had to ask the scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees? And if the world needed to stay at 1.5 degrees, what would this mean? And that was the result of the report in October 2018. We wouldn't have had that report if we hadn't had the pressure of not just small island states, but the least developed countries, the indigenous peoples, the civil society, the marching in the street, the pressure of public opinion. We need that pressure again, and I'm glad that there is a very big shaping up of what's called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's a forum of more than 48 countries now. It was 48 countries. I gather it's over 50 now. It's being led in a way by the Maldives and by Mohammed Nasheed, who had played a role when he was president of the Maldives in Copenhagen. He's now Speaker of the Parliament, but he's very active. They've got quite a lot of business rowing in behind that we have to have a COP that is aligned with 1.5. No question. And we have to have a mechanism to do that. Now, we're not there. And, it's like before Paris, we're not there. But that's the work we have to do.
Renata, por favor.
Presidente Robson, é um prazer. Sabemos que a COP26 fala muito sobre a proteção da biodiversidade, mas o que temos visto hoje como um tema central é o mercado de créditos de carbono. Sabemos que a redução do carbono é muito importante no mundo, mas as empresas que estão, né, negociando esse crédito de carbono são as mesmas empresas que poluem e têm promovido também muita destruição aos ecossistemas e biomas no mundo. E eu queria saber se você vê como uma medida eficaz essa questão dos créditos de carbono, uma vez que as mesmas empresas que pagam por esse crédito milhões para poder proteger determinadas áreas são as mesmas empresas que estão também poluindo no mundo e continuam a poluir e destruindo comunidades indígenas. Então, seria a minha pergunta.
In fact, the elders have talked a lot about carbon markets or a carbon price. And we would strongly favour a carbon price, a proper carbon tax, a high enough carbon tax to tax the externalities of carbon, the harm it's doing to health, the many deaths from indoor and outdoor fossil fuel pollution, the despoiling of nature, etc. All of these should be factored in with a carbon tax. The carbon market is another way of trying to regulate, but actually we don't think it's as effective, and I agree that in many ways it can sort of suit the traders in fossil fuel, and a carbon tax is much more effective.
Cláudio Ângelo, por favor.
Boa noite, presidente. A gente está vendo na organização da COP26 uma espécie de microcosmo do mesmo problema de desigualdade que tem atormentado as negociações de clima durante 27 anos agora, né? Então, a COP acontece num momento no qual os países em desenvolvimento reclamam de má distribuição de vacinas. A maior rede de organizações da sociedade civil, a Climate Action Network, escreveu uma carta dizendo que a COP não era justa nem equitativa e, portanto, deveria ser adiada. Eu queria saber se a senhora acha que o governo britânico errou ao insistir em manter a COP num contexto de pandemia e de distribuição muito injusta de vacina entre países ricos e países em desenvolvimento, e se a senhora acha que isso pode contaminar as negociações em Glasgow e tirar o foco do que deve ser feito em termos de ambição climática para se ficar discutindo pandemia e acesso à vacina.
I think it's a good question, and I understand the problem. It is shocking and unacceptable that we have not had fair and equitable access to vaccines around the world. It is actually shocking because COVID itself has exacerbated, made worse, all the inequalities, and they are connected. Racial inequality, gender inequality, poverty inequality, etc. And I understand the voice of civil society, quite a lot of it, that asked, could there be a postponement so that there can be more from developing countries and more of the voices of those most affected at the COP. We have already postponed, as you know. It should have taken place last year. I myself feel it is too urgent. We actually need this COP. I'm glad that, as I mentioned, the Climate Vulnerable Forum of more than 48 countries, more than 50 countries now, will be a strong voice on one side. Civil society, many of us, and I'm civil society now, will be insisting on ensuring that the voices of those who need to be heard, Indigenous peoples, young people, the young climate activists, that they are heard and that they penetrate at COP. And it's not perfect at all. It certainly has been made worse by COVID. It's less fair because of COVID, I accept that. But we don't have time. It's so urgent. We have to go ahead with this COP and make the best possible results from it.
Já que o Cláudio trouxe à baila o tema da pandemia, eu fiz menção no início do programa a uma parte do seu prefácio em que a senhora disse que a gente está vivendo apenas um trailer de um futuro que já chegou por meio das mudanças climáticas e que as mudanças climáticas explicam o surgimento da pandemia, né? Esse escape de um vírus animal que atinge a humanidade como um todo. Qual a sua perspectiva para esse aspecto das mudanças climáticas, o surgimento de pandemias sucessivas e cada vez mais próximas umas das outras? A gente vai viver esse cenário também?
I'm afraid the prediction is that we will have more pandemics. That was already the prediction. In fact, one of the elders that I chair, who were brought together by Nelson Mandela, Gru Brundtland, is a former Director General of the World Health Organization, and she was on a different panel that predicted in September 2019, we are going to have another pandemic and we're not ready for it. We're not prepared. And now we have a report on pandemic preparedness that was co-chaired by another elder, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and Helen Clark of New Zealand. And they have, it's a very serious report and required steps to be taken already by governments. And of course, there's not the leadership that we need at the moment at that level. And, it's pretty shocking. It's interesting, you quoted the foreword to my book. I've been thinking a lot, partly because of the launch in Brazil, which I'm very happy about, that when I was writing that book in 2018, I had to sort of look quite hard for climate stories in the rich parts of the world. I could find many. There are 11 stories in the book, and 9 of them involve women making their communities more relevant. But I always joke, but I mean it seriously too, that there are 2 good men. One a former president of a very small island who, Anote Tong, who, was very worried about Copenhagen, and also another good man. But the point is, I found stories. I found the post-Katrina, that story of East Biloxi being destroyed and how Sharon Henshaw became an accidental activist. And I found Patricia Cochrane in Alaska. But I was searching with difficulty for the real stories. And in Europe, I found a story of the Sami people right up in northern Sweden to illustrate the way climate was affecting. Now, just a few years later, I would have no difficulty with the fires, with the flooding, it would be much easier because the northern hemisphere is at last being affected in the way that the southern hemisphere and poorer parts of the northern hemisphere were being affected. But now it's hitting Australia, it's hitting California, it's hitting Brussels, Belgium and Germany, Portugal, Spain with fires, etc. So, I'm hoping that the very fact that we're so much more conscious of climate will help a groundswell that will put the pressure on the leaders to do what is necessary.
Cristina?
Presidente, o seu livro traz relatos muito dramáticos dos efeitos que as mudanças climáticas já estão trazendo para populações no mundo inteiro. Me chamaram a atenção algumas situações que a senhora relata na África, inclusive de comunidades que precisam se deslocar agora buscando por terras férteis em que eles ainda possam cultivar e plantar, etc. E a senhora traz uma frase que me tocou muito profundamente, em que a senhora diz, todos viajam pelos corredores da morte. A senhora está se referindo a comunidades de pastores que precisam se deslocar em busca de terras e água. E relata também a questão das migrações forçadas, da desnutrição de crianças. Enfim, é um relato bastante dramático que precisa ser enfrentado na conferência, de cúpula em Glasgow. A minha pergunta é a seguinte, e a senhora tem dado bastante ênfase aos esforços e à participação da sociedade civil nessas discussões. Mas a gente sabe que as empresas e os governos precisam atuar fortemente para, de fato, conseguir combater a mudança climática e o aumento de temperatura no planeta. Então, a minha pergunta é, como convencer ou como fazer com que empresas e governos, governos que resistem mais ao combate à crise climática, como comprometê-los, de fato, com essas medidas que precisam ser tomadas, para manter a temperatura num nível que não seja catastrófico, porque, como a senhora mesma afirma no seu livro, trata-se de uma questão de justiça climática, que é um imperativo ético e moral. Só que como comprometer essas empresas, quando a gente sabe que muitas dessas empresas, inclusive, fazem muita propaganda, muito marketing, né, verde, mas de fato são empresas violadoras, inclusive, de direitos humanos.
Well, what we are seeing, and I think we'll see much more of this, is law cases in courts in different parts of the world. There was a case recently against the oil company Shell, and fining Shell a very big amount of money. And Shell has appealed. We'll see what happens. There was a case in Ireland, and the Irish government had to do more because of that case. There was a case in France. France has to do more. The first case was in the Netherlands, and was a kind of, seemed to be a once-off case, but it isn't. There was a very important case in Germany, and Germany has had to increase its ambition. There are other cases that young climate activists have been trying, and some of them have not succeeded, but others have. And I think because we're seeing the causation of the shocks of climate change being linked to human behaviour now, to the fossil fuel companies, the emissions. We can measure it now. We can measure it scientifically much more. And therefore we can bring cases in court. So that's one way. But at a COP, it requires that the right voices are heard. I agree with you there. I have heard the voices of those I told stories about, raising their voices, being at the COP, like Constance O'Kellet from Uganda. She comes to COPs and speaks with that sort of very strong, deliberate voice of absolute knowledge of how dangerous climate change is. And then the delegates stop, they literally, lift their heads and listen, because they haven't heard this before. They work in a kind of technical way. They see each other all the time at conferences and they fight over words and phrases, but they don't know the reality until the reality is spoken at the table. So that is important, to have indigenous voices, to have young voices, to have grassroots voices at COPs. And I know it's going to be harder because of COVID, I accept that, but I also know that special care is being taken to ensure that enough of those voices will be there.
Com isso, então, nós chegamos ao fim do nosso primeiro bloco desse Roda Viva. Vamos para um breve intervalo e voltamos já já com a entrevista com a Mary Robinson.
Bradesco, transforme o futuro.
Estamos de volta com o Roda Viva, que hoje recebe a ex-presidente da Irlanda, Mary Robinson, que é a atual presidente do Elders, um grupo de ex-governantes que endereça várias questões, entre elas a questão climática. A pergunta agora é do Leonardo Sakamoto.
Presidente Robinson, seguindo um pouco na linha da minha colega, a senhora falou de empresas que são levadas a cortes na Irlanda, na França, na Holanda, na Alemanha. O que acontece é que tem os transnacionais que, para escapar da regulação ambiental e social de seus países sede, eles vão poluir e explorar trabalho na periferia do mundo, aproveitando-se muitas vezes de governos que são corruptos ou pobres. E há no Alto Comissariado de Direitos Humanos da ONU, que a senhora chefiou, um grupo de empresas e direitos humanos que tenta fazer uma discussão para que a gente passe de princípios orientadores de empresas, que são princípios voluntários, para princípios obrigatórios, vinculantes, Contudo, esse debate está atrasadíssimo, ele está indo muito lentamente. E aí a pergunta, quais saídas a gente tem para garantir que empresas andem na linha internacionalmente, que empresas não sigam para países do terceiro mundo para emitir gases de efeito estufa, para poluir ou para explorar?
I will come to your question, but I just wanted to clarify that the cases I was talking about, yes, the Shell case was against a company, but most of the cases I referenced, the case in Ireland was against the Irish government, the case in France was against the French government, the case in Germany against the German government, the case in the Netherlands against the Netherlands government, and all those governments had to increase their ambition because the courts required it. And they're rule of law countries, so they accept the court's verdict. And that's what I was saying. But you do make an important point about the fact that is the reality, that multilateral companies come to poor countries and extract from those poor countries mineral wealth. Oil, gas, gold, diamonds, whatever it is. And very often they do it in a way that pollutes locally, affects the health of people locally, and they don't get the benefit. And that has been a problem. And I remember when I served as High Commissioner, we were dealing with that. And then we got, as you rightly said, the guiding principles, but they're non-binding. They have a stronger voice than you might think, because they were passed unanimously by the Human Rights Council. And a lot of businesses find that if they don't take them seriously, investors are moving their money away. Investors want to invest in companies now that have what's called ESG policies, environmental, social and governance policies. And that's become much more standard. And now we have a new stage, if you like, where some companies that I'm very close to, they're called the B team of companies, are saying, actually, it's not enough now to do your ESG, economic, social and governance as a company. You actually have to go beyond that, because companies, the world has tipped the scales against nature, and we've gone too far. And we have to now regenerate, reforest, capture carbon, really get back to a safe course to a 1.5 world. And for example, one business leader whom I'm a good friend of, Paul Polman, has written a book called Net Positive. And that's what he said is the standard now that companies should comply with. Not just trying to be sustainable for the future. That's not good enough, because you have to make up for what you broke, which is you broke by your corporate behavior and the balance of nature. So you've got to actually go further and be net positive in your business. Now, he's giving a leadership that, a few countries at the moment might follow, but it's still, if you like, putting moral and civil society voice on companies to change in the absence of compelling legislation, if you like.
Giovanna, por favor.
Presidente Robinson, existe uma certa confiança quando se fala em lidar com as emissões de emissões de gases de efeito estufa, que é tudo uma perspectiva de tecnologia. Com tecnologia é possível reduzir as emissões. Agora, na perspectiva da justiça climática, a senhora defende que a gente não pode olhar só para a redução das emissões sem olhar para a questão do respeito aos direitos humanos. E no começo, no primeiro bloco, a senhora comentou como que o Acordo de Paris só deu certo porque havia essa perspectiva humana, de a pressão das pequenas ilhas. A senhora acha que a abordagem da justiça climática, de certo modo, facilita as negociações, no sentido de que torna as pessoas mais sensibilizadas para o problema, ou dificulta a resolução do problema quando se olha para as emissões só pensando, é tecnologia, a gente pode passar por cima de tudo. Quanto que ajuda e quanto que atrapalha quando se olha sob a perspectiva da justiça climática?
It's a very interesting question, and I think there has been a change over time which I welcome. When I started to talk about climate justice, and the reason I did was I came to the whole recognition of the climate issue when I was working on human rights in African countries. I was working on the rights that really matter if you don't have them, rights to food and water, health, education, and women, peace and security issues. I was also honorary president of Oxfam, and Oxfam were encouraging me to visit various countries. And I saw for the first time the huge undermining of all these human rights because of climate shocks. Even the right to life itself, but certainly food security, everything was put at risk. And so that was how I came to it. So it was natural to me to speak about climate justice, and I had a Climate Justice Foundation, Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. And a number of people said to me, don't talk about climate justice. It's people, it makes it more difficult, was what I was told. I think that has swung. And I think thanks to young people, thanks to Indigenous people, and we've begun to understand the layers of injustice that make it compelling that we have to talk about climate justice. And those layers are, I'll give you the 5 layers very quickly. The first layer is it affects disproportionately and much earlier the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples, and they, by and large, are the black and brown and indigenous peoples in our world, so it's a racial injustice as well. Secondly, within that, the gender injustice, the different social roles of women, different rights sometimes. They don't have land rights in some countries. They don't have access to credit, but they have to put food on the table. They have to make their communities resilient. The gender injustice, the intergenerational injustice that young activists have been calling us out on, and rightly. And fourthly, and this is a subtle one but very important, the injustice of the different pathways to development of different regions of the world. The industrialized world, you know, Europe, the United States, Japan, Korea, etc., we built our economies on fossil fuel. Now we have to wean ourselves off very fast with just transition. For the workers, we have to remember it was the workers who built our economies, and they now need a just transition, either to be pensioned off if they've worked for a number of years and they're too old to reskill, or to be skilled in the green jobs, and their communities benefit from heightened locating in these areas of green jobs, good green jobs. And developing countries want to go green, but it's much harder if they haven't got a base of building their economies on fossil fuel like the rich countries did. And they're not getting the technology and the skills and the training nearly as much as they should be to help them. So they have that dilemma, a different dilemma in taking their people out of poverty. And the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself. And we've only recently properly factored that in preparations for COP26. There is the other convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will take place virtually at the moment, but also in Kunming in China, physically next May, they hope. It may, it's been postponed already, but I hope it won't have to be postponed again. But we need to bring these two much, much closer together, because we need nature-based solutions to reduce emissions and to have better adaptation on all sides. We need that. But those layers of injustice have become even more evident because of COVID. As we said earlier, it has exacerbated them all.
Certo. Cláudio, por favor.
Presidente, no último dia 20, 11 dias antes do início da COP26, um grupo de países em desenvolvimento publicou um manifesto assinado em La Paz, na Bolívia, dizendo que a proposta de net zero em 2050, de zerar as emissões em 2050, que vem sendo defendida principalmente pelos países desenvolvidos, puxados pelos Estados Unidos, ia contra o conceito de justiça climática. Esses países argumentam que os países desenvolvidos, primeiro, adiaram a ação climática, e agora que eles já desenvolveram a tecnologia de energias renováveis para vender no mundo inteiro, eles pressionam para que todo mundo acelere, todos os países, inclusive os países em desenvolvimento, acelerem o corte de emissões. E esses países, que são chamados like-minded developing countries, que são os países, a linha dura dos países em desenvolvimento nas negociações, argumentam que eles não deveriam ser obrigados a fazer isso. Existe alguma justiça nessa reclamação por parte desses países?
It is a very interesting question, and it's one that I felt it important in my foundation on climate justice that we would study really thoroughly whether that argument was valid. And it isn't valid for a reason that's very clear when you look into it. As I mentioned, the first injustice is that climate change affects much earlier and much disproportionately heavier the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states and indigenous peoples. So if countries say, we weren't responsible for the earlier emissions, we're going to now develop our oil and coal and gas and just go ahead, they will be the most affected first, that country's people. That's just it's a location unfairness as well. They're the parts of the world that are already most vulnerable, and therefore they would be affected earliest and worst. So it's not an argument, let me put it this way, it's an argument of science that is objective across the board, that we absolutely have to align with 1.5 degrees. I think we should do it before 2050 myself, but I'm glad that countries and companies are making that commitment. We tried at Paris to get more attention to that, and we got a little bit. But now there is much more attention by governments, and it's become a standard of nationally determined contributions to build in to be net zero. I think the young people are exasperated and say 2050 is far too long away. What are you going to do this year, next year, the year after, up to 2030? And I absolutely agree that needs to be the focus, of course. But the long-term goal, as it's called, puts a kind of discipline into how the voluntary commitments, because after all they are voluntary because of Paris, how they will be done. And it's peer pressure then, pressure of countries, pressure on companies, working in a way that forces, and money is changing, investment is moving quite quickly to only investing in renewables. And I do believe that developing countries may need, for example, I'm conscious of the need for gas in Africa as a just transition to being able to have renewable energy. You need a base load of electricity that helps you then to turn green in the way that developing countries have done. But it should be a just transition and be well over by 2050.
Renata, por favor.
Presidente Robson, quando escutamos falar sobre justiça climática, também estamos pensando nos direitos da natureza. E quando falamos nesse movimento global dos direitos da natureza, que vem justamente da inspiração no pensamento dos povos originários e que faz parte também da Constituição no Equador, né? Eu sempre vejo que, por mais que a gente veja constantemente essas empresas também disputando lobby, né, nessas mudanças do relatório climático, né, que é uma realidade da qual a gente sabe que existe mesmo antes de ver vazando na imprensa, né, eu queria saber se você vê projetos de lei como esse como uma solução mais efetiva, uma forma de inibir essas empresas e essas multinacionais ao adentrar os territórios. E quando você esteve na Somália, você viu uma realidade lá muito, muito pesada. E dessa realidade também de desapropriação de terras, onde as pessoas mais humildes são sempre as que sofrem e as comunidades tradicionais também. Mas, principalmente, no momento que elas estão defendendo a vida e essa natureza, elas também são chamadas de terroristas. Aqui no Brasil, a gente tem visto isso muito com a população indígena e todos que tentam defender esses biomas, né? Então, eu queria saber se dentro dessa questão desses projetos de lei, tem todo esse movimento global pelos direitos da natureza, que parte justamente de ver esses recursos naturais de uma outra forma, muito mais respeitosa, não apenas como objeto, né, mas como um ser vivo, né, um ser vivo e com direitos próprios, da mesma forma que existem os direitos humanos.
I think it's a really, really important question, and I'm glad when I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that I had a lot of interaction with Indigenous peoples, because I was the coordinator of the Decade of Indigenous Peoples. It's a kind of UN way of doing things, kind of clumsy, but it did give me huge insights at the time, and I've built on those with a significant number of Indigenous friends that I listen to, and they are full of profound spirituality and wisdom that really affects me. And I'm aware, for example, that Indigenous people save a great deal of the forests of the world, and yet, as you say, they can be hounded or prosecuted or killed. And we have a terrible problem of, I call them human rights defenders, who defend the land rights or the water rights of their community, and they are very much at risk at the moment. There was a larger number killed last year than I think we've ever seen. So it is a real worry that this happens, if I could put it that way. But I also see that young people, the young climate activists talk in terms of linking with nature, and some of us did a project in Italy for the architectural Venice Biennale. We called it a future assembly, And it was assembly that went well beyond human to to trees, but also to water, to air, and said all of the, all components have a right not to be extinct. As you know, one of the terrible problems is the extinction of species. And so, there's a right not to be made extinct, at least. And that, we can and should see ourselves in a kind of continuum in the way that indigenous peoples do, and not just think that human rights are for humans alone. Now, I'm a very strong human rights advocate. I don't want to weaken the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or all the other treaties and the covenants on human rights, but I'm very aware of reaching out now for a broader, more comprehensive approach that does see our links with nature as being part of who we are and part of how we must live. And I think COVID, if I may, COVID gives us good examples. We changed behavior because of COVID when we didn't have a vaccine. We wore masks, we washed our hands much more often, we socially distanced, etc. And what I'm saying now, particularly in the industrialized world, in Europe, in the United States, etc., I'm saying over and over again, we must change our consumption behavior. We must consume less, we must consume far less meat. I explain I've become a pescatarian. I moved from being a meat eating to now only fish and vegetables. I kind of lapsed a bit during COVID, I have to admit, because my husband is not a pescatarian. He loves his meat, and so it's a bit difficult when there are just the two of us. But, everybody has to make an effort. In fact, if I may, I'm giving a very long answer, I know, but I want to emphasize the three messages that I give to any audience that I speak to. I say, make the climate crisis personal in your own life. And that means you're doing something today you weren't doing yesterday, like recycling that bit more carefully, or changing your diet, or changing the way you move around, not in a non-electric car or whatever. And secondly, get angry with those responsibility. And that's governments, it's business, it's cities, it's anybody with the capacity to affect the climate issue. And if they're not doing it, then get angry and use your voice, your vote, whatever you can to change that. And thirdly, we have to imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards. We don't do enough of that. In 9 years' time, we have to have a world where cities are free of the pollution of fossil fuel, so everybody will be much healthier. It will be much greener because we will have planted trees. We will have city gardens, vertical gardens. We will have a lot of regeneration in the rural countryside. We will have the Amazon refreshed with more regeneration. We must have, but we must imagine it so that we push for it.
Cristina.
Nenhum país do mundo conseguiu se desenvolver sem emitir carbono, sem emitir gases poluentes. Mas agora, no momento, o que a gente discute é como é que a gente sai dessa realidade do desenvolvimento baseado na queima de combustíveis fósseis, como petróleo e carvão, e passamos para um desenvolvimento baseado nas energias renováveis. Só que muitos países pobres ou subdesenvolvidos ou em desenvolvimento tem que, então, reorientar a sua economia baseada em energias renováveis, né? Só que isso custa muito dinheiro, muito dinheiro. Então, a Conferência de Glasgow precisa enfrentar essa questão também. Em que medida os países ricos, os que mais poluem, aqueles que têm um padrão de consumo absolutamente insustentável, como é que esses países ricos vão ajudar os outros países pobres ou em desenvolvimento a fazer o seu desenvolvimento já com base em energias renováveis? Quanto de dinheiro está em jogo? Quanto os países ricos poderão oferecer? Quer dizer, qual é a ordem de grandeza dessa ajuda em bilhões de dólares para que todos possam caminhar no sentido das energias renováveis e sabendo também que há uma resistência muito grande da indústria ainda baseada em combustíveis fósseis?
I think that's a really important and challenging question, and a really thoughtful one, because this is what we have to think about. We didn't, make it easy for developing countries to go as green and modern in their green jobs as they want to, because we haven't shared the technology. We haven't invested capital to enable those countries to develop, etc. It is very necessary that we do that. It is true that, for example, China is a leader in the world on wind and solar. And actually, in one way of describing it, units of producing electricity, wind and solar are becoming much cheaper than coal or oil and gas. It's amazing how the price is dropping, but it's not dropping for developing countries, because to get access to that clean energy, you have to invest up front. It's a cost. It's a cost of getting whatever it is, whether it's an electric car, whether it's even a cook stove, an LPG cook stove is more expensive. And very poor people can't afford it unless there is support for it. So we have to be realistic. And I believe that renewable energy must be subsidized to become very affordable very quickly for people, so that they understand that this is actually much better and it's cheaper. And we need co-investment, if I could call it that, in the green hydrogen, which can make a huge difference in manufacturing, in trucks, even in shipping, I gather. In big, when you need heavy energy, hydrogen is likely to be the substitute. Again, developing countries can't develop that on their own, but why don't we have cooperative development now? Because we're one planet. And, there are no jobs on a dead planet, as has been said over and over. And so we need much more cooperation in sharing the technology and working together to ensure that developing countries can move forward and in some cases have gas as a brief transition for longer than the industrialized countries, which means the industrialized countries have to be even more ambitious about getting out of fossil fuel even faster.
Com isso, então, encerramos o nosso segundo bloco do Roda Viva. Vamos para mais um breve intervalo e voltamos já com a entrevista com a ex-presidente da Irlanda, Mary Robinson.
Bradesco, transforme o futuro.
Estamos de volta com a entrevista com a ex-presidente da Irlanda, Mary Robinson. Estamos falando principalmente sobre a COP26, que começa no próximo dia 31 de outubro. Presidente, eu queria continuar nesse assunto da geopolítica e de como os países devem contribuir para que a gente caminhe aí para conter, para mitigar os efeitos da mudança climática. Os Estados Unidos, com o governo Joe Biden, voltam a ser um protagonista nessa equação. Inclusive, o presidente Biden estará em Glasgow para participar da COP, algo que o ex-presidente Donald Trump negligenciava ou até achava que era desnecessário. Qual a importância da volta dos Estados Unidos como protagonista e como a senhora vê um pleito do Brasil, do governo brasileiro, de que para fazer a sua parte, para se comprometer com metas mais arrojadas, ele precisa ser pago? O presidente Jair Bolsonaro tem vocalizado esse discurso de que o Brasil precisa ser compensado. É mais ou menos o que a Cristina estava perguntando no bloco anterior, mas ele endereça isso diretamente ao Brasil, que o Brasil precisa ser compensado financeiramente pelos seus compromissos climáticos. Como a senhora vê essa mentalidade meio financista aí na assunção de metas e compromissos climáticos?
Well, first of all, relating to what you said at the beginning, I do believe it's important that President Biden and his administration are serious about climate. John Kerry is very serious about it as well, because we need the leadership. When President Trump pulled the United States out, it was very bad, and other countries kind of slowed up. We lost momentum. Now, this is going to help, both with the G20 and with the COP itself to try and get more ambition. But frankly, the United States should do more. The problem is Congress. At the moment, there's a big bill, as you probably know, which includes a number of important, beneficial to people climate measures. But the Republicans won't support it all. And there's a very tight thing where Senator Manchin is potentially going to remove or cause, say he won't support unless those climate provisions are removed. That won't help trust in the COP. And I was very vocal in the United States very recently as part of the elders with former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon in saying to the United States, first of all, cooperate with China. Compete all right, but don't fight with China. That doesn't help the world. And secondly, you need to step up both on more on finance and more on your commitments. But I don't accept the arguments of President Bolsonaro at all. In fact, I think the foot is on. His government is not fulfilling a responsibility that is both political and moral. It is really shocking, and it's, as I said earlier, it's shocking to see the deaths the deaths and unnecessarily serious illness for people through COVID, and it's shocking to see what's happening in the Amazon, and it is very sad that a great country like Brazil, I made a state visit as President of Ireland. I've been there a number of times when I was High Commissioner, etc. And you have a great civil society, you have people who are really good on climate science, climate activism, and it's a shame that the government at the moment is failing the people. That's how I put it. And the government is failing the people of Brazil.
Sakamoto, por favor.
Presidente Robinson, o Brasil é um dos maiores produtores e exportadores de alimentos do mundo, mas ao mesmo tempo nós estamos vivendo um momento em que há pelo menos 19 milhões de famintos no país. Essa situação dessa dualidade não acontece só no Brasil. Eu queria ouvir da senhora qual que é a alavanca para a mudança dessa lógica.
I think there is a real need to look at the global food industry. There are people looking at it very seriously. Let's take the first point, which is shameful. We waste a third of the food produced in the world every year. We waste a third of it. It either in the rich world gets thrown away because of a sell-by date. It may be perfectly edible, but it's just thrown away because we're a throwaway society too much. Or for farmers, they can't get access because of flooding to their fields, or there's a terrible problem. It's different in different parts of the world. It may be lack of refrigeration in some cases, and so on. But we waste a third of the food, and then we actually we produce a lot of food that's not good for the body. It's mass produced, and it's eaten mainly by poor people, and they develop diabetes, and diabetes is a very big problem now in the developing world as a result. It's not good produce because it's not freshly grown and green, and etc. So right across the board, we need to, and it's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at production and consumption, and I think we need to take it more seriously. And there are almost monopolies of food production in a small number of very major companies, and they too must be held to their responsibility.
Eu gostaria de voltar um pouco na questão que a Vera colocou da geopolítica do clima. A senhora tinha mencionado mais cedo o papel importante que a ministra Isabela Teixeira do Brasil teve em Paris para que se chegasse a um acordo. E de fato a diplomacia brasileira costumava ser muito bem vista nas negociações climáticas em outras COPs, tendo um papel importante de amarração, de fazer conexão entre os países desenvolvidos e em desenvolvimento. E, inclusive aparando arestas, né? Sempre teve muito a diplomacia brasileira sempre foi muito elogiada nesse sentido. Esse comportamento que o Brasil está tendo agora, como a Vera mencionou, de mais cobrança do que colaboração, isso já vem desde a COP de Madrid, né, em 2019. A senhora acha que esse comportamento pode, por exemplo, comprometer que em Glasgow se chegue a um resultado mais positivo, se o Brasil deixar de fazer esse papel que sempre fez, isso a senhora acha que pode vir a comprometer o avanço das negociações?
Só complementando a pergunta da Giovana, o Brasil está preparando para Glasgow um maciço esforço de greenwash que inclui um pavilhão de 200 metros quadrados cofinanciado por lobbies de indústria. Como é que o Brasil deveria ser tratado pela comunidade internacional e pelos seus parceiros internacionais na Conferência de Glasgow? Como é que a senhora acha que seria uma maneira de dos países não caírem na conversa que o Brasil deve apresentar na conferência?
Yeah, well, on the first part, the more positive part of Brazil that you made reference to, I learned a lot from my friends in Brazil about South-South cooperation. And Brazil did, you know, there was a very real role played in the road to Paris, in convening and in reaching out, etc. And we really benefited from that. And I wish that we had more, you know, I wish this current administration in Brazil under President Bolsonaro had some sense of that, because it would help a lot if it did. But unfortunately, this is not very apparent, to say the least. And I think we need to distinguish between bad governments and the people of a country, many of whom would wish their leader would do differently. I know there are many Brazilians who want Brazil to be a leader on climate justice and a leader that brings the country forward in the right way. And I think, you know, those of us who will be in the public eye in COP26 must be careful not to demonize a country in a way that seems to also demonize the people of that country. No, let's be very particular. It's just bad governance. It's not taking responsibilities properly, and that's what it is. It's not, and people sometimes just cannot, you know, prevent in the short term until there's an election or something happens. That's the way it is. But we need to be particular and go, and certainly the elders will speak out about the countries that are not doing enough. I hope that Brazil, which will be at the G20, will in fact feel the pressure and you know, try to be more ambitious about what it's doing, and in particular change course on the Amazon, which is so important. And if that happens, we will be the first to acknowledge and to be supportive of it.
Em relação a essa maneira como o mundo vê o Brasil e essa tentativa do Brasil de mitigar a sua imagem ruim, que o Cláudio perguntou?
Well, you know, I think the truth is COVID has exposed very much how bad the government has been in its leadership, in its example, in its language, in everything. And then people see, well, it's equally not taking seriously the climate crisis. And that's an existential threat to the people of Brazil, but also to the whole world. And therefore, you know, I think it is fair to criticize very sharply any government that is not taking its responsibility at the moment, because it is too serious.
Renata?
Presidente Robson, qual o maior risco que corremos, né, na COP26 em relação ao que essas empresas têm buscado? Qual o maior risco que a Justiça Climática corre em não ser implementada todas as questões que vão ser colocadas lá, mas principalmente as modificações às quais elas estão sujeitas? Para você, qual o maior risco?
I think the major risk in COP26 will be a sort of breakdown of trust between those countries most affected by climate change, speaking about climate justice and not seeing a commitment of the big emitters. And the big emitters are the historic emitters, but also the large emerging countries, the G20. If they don't, you know, step up much more than they've done, and they do it in Rome before COP, then I can see a problem of trust really at the conference. And then with that, the production gap that the UN Environment Programme published yesterday, is scary, because it's saying every government is going to increase its production. Every significant government, including the US, is going to increase its oil and gas and maybe reduce coal, and the UK is reducing coal. But, the International Energy Agency has made it quite clear there should be no new exploration of coal in particular, but also no new exploration of oil and gas. That's what the International Energy Agency has said, which used to be quite conservative and supportive of fossil fuel in the past, because they read the science and they understand. So, I think it's going to be difficult at the COP to manage expectations, but also to politically ensure that we are on track to a 1.5 degree world. The elders, I can tell you, we will be doing our utmost to keep that focus, keep that attention, and keep saying, if the COP in Glasgow is aligned to 1.5, I don't mean already on course to achieve it, but I mean it's within reach because a process. What I mean is, in the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that countries would increase their ambition every 5 years. What we're saying is no. Countries that need to increase their ambition must do it every year. The countries that should be giving more in finance must do it every year, not every 5 years. We must have a sort of pathway that accelerates because of the urgency.
Com isso, então, chegamos ao fim do nosso terceiro bloco. Vamos para mais uma breve interrupção e voltamos já já com o Roda Viva.
Bradesco, transforme o futuro.
Estamos de volta com o Roda Viva e a pergunta agora é da Cristina Serra. Cris.
Presidente Robinson, a senhora mencionou várias vezes aqui na nossa conversa sua preocupação com a Amazônia. A minha pergunta é, se a senhora tivesse a oportunidade de se encontrar com o presidente Bolsonaro ou estar frente a frente com a missão brasileira que vai a Glasgow, o que a senhora falaria para o presidente Bolsonaro sobre a necessidade de proteger a Amazônia?
I think what I would try to do is convey how extraordinary it is that Brazil has so much of the Amazon. It doesn't have it all, but it has a very large part of it, one of the greatest lungs of humanity that is in danger, endangered. And we know that now. It is endangered. And it could be very critical for future living on this planet. And you have the opportunity. And you need, yes, the support. You don't need compensation, that's the wrong language, but you do need support and will get support if you have the right policies from business and from other countries, because everybody has an interest in the Amazon.
Presidente Robinson, a gente vê as cidades como um principal foco hoje de riscos aí à vida na Terra e de total descaso com as necessidades de mudanças que a gente tem que fazer no nosso comportamento como cidadãos para que a gente não escale na emergência climática. Então, a gente tem aí toda a questão dos resíduos que não está resolvida e que foi agravada com a pandemia. A gente tem aí toneladas e mais toneladas de máscaras, de outros resíduos hospitalares, tornando isso ainda mais grave. A gente tem a questão dos resíduos plásticos que não está resolvida, tem o nosso consumo exacerbado, que ninguém está pensando em abrir mão de nenhuma comodidade. O que na COP vai ser feito para abrir os olhos das pessoas, desses que estão nos assistindo agora, de que todo dia alguém tem que fazer alguma coisa diferente?
I think you're right that cities can be really part of the problem, but they can also be part of a great opportunity for cities to transform themselves. And there are wonderful networks of cities, the G40 network and other C40 network and other networks, where cities are in a sort of alliance with each other in different parts of the world to help each other, learn from each other, and learn, good inventive ways with the transport, with the waste management, as you said, and with the greening of the city, with having city gardens, having buildings that are generating electricity, not absorbing it, not using it, but generating it, and so on and so on. Now, there isn't nearly enough of this, but we have to see that if we could just, cooperate more together, including cities cooperating more, as some of them are doing, and doing very exciting things with. And it's all over the world. I mean, Freetown, a city in Sierra Leone, is a good example. Sierra Leone's a poor country, but Freetown as a city is really trying. Durham in South Africa is another one. And, and then, you've got, Chicago, and you've got Sydney, and you have cities all over the world that are really making efforts. Paris, obviously, following the conference there in Paris, really trying to move ahead and giving good leadership. There's a lot of good leadership in cities that we're seeing more than we're seeing overall in countries today on the climate crisis.
Cláudia?
Presidente, a senhora falou agora há pouco da gente imaginar um mundo diferente, um mundo no qual nós estaremos vivendo daqui a alguns anos. A ciência não tem nos deixado sonhar de um jeito muito otimista, né? Poucos dias atrás, a Agência Internacional de Energia publicou um relatório dizendo que 60% das reduções de emissões que precisam ser feitas nesta década vêm de tecnologias que ainda estão em fase de protótipo ou ainda na bancada. E a gente vê em todas as aberturas de conferência do clima um discurso muito forte de precisamos ter esperança e se ainda dá tempo de manter o 1,5 sob alcance. Esse discurso de esperança não está amolecendo um pouco a gente? Não está na hora da gente abandonar esse discurso esperançoso e dizer, gente, não dá mais tempo, mas cada tonelada de carbono que a gente conseguir mitigar importa muito agora?
I must say, I find that I am being more direct and more explicit in my criticisms of those who should be doing more. I think you can feel that as journalists. I'm speaking out. The elders are speaking out because we see exactly that time is running out. In their report in October 2018, the scientists collectively, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said you have to reduce by 45% by 2030 carbon emissions globally. It is doable if you have the political will. We have wasted the years since 2018, wasted them, and we're facing a COP now where we really have to make change. Nelson Mandela asked us to bring hope, but we're not optimists, we're prisoners of hope. And we will do it by seeing what is positive that we can say, but also calling out those who have not done what they should have done. And you will hear that criticism, certainly from the elders, in our voices at COP and after COP. And we will continue to put pressure on governments. I have written as chair of the COP, to every member of the G20, letters that are individual to each of them. To the chair of the COP, which is Italy, they should be paying more finance. They're not paying enough, and nor is France, about the 100 billion. So I say that in the letter. They're polite letters, but they're very clear in what they say. And then to those who haven't yet declared their nationally determined contributions, you need to do that. To those who are not ambitious enough, you need to do that. Now, it's just a moral voice from the elders, but we are committed to use whatever persuasion we can have because of the urgency. And that is the problem of this COP. There's an awful lot to do and not enough leadership, but it is good that President Biden will be there. It's good that there will be voices that will be urging. And we know that there was hesitation before Paris as to whether we would get agreement. So let's not be fatalistic. let's work to make it happen.
Presidente Robinson, há ainda líderes políticos e econômicos que ainda propagam a ideia de que as mudanças climáticas são uma grande fake news. Que sugestão a senhora daria para um cidadão comum poder enfrentar o negacionismo?
I think it is really shocking that we have a world where fake news is so broadcast, and I think the social media platforms have a big responsibility which they're not taking. That's another subject, but it's something that has to be addressed. You cannot have democracy and good governance if you don't have objective, science-based facts that people on all sides agree on. They may disagree on how to go forward in the context of that, but they shouldn't dispute the points about science, the points about nature, all of that. That should guide us, because you can see when you ignore it, like in COVID, when you ignore the science of COVID, the health warnings and the need for vaccination, that you have far, far more deaths. It's lethal to undermine the scientific objectivity of the need for to believe in the reality of the factual world.
Presidente Robinson, eu queria voltar nesse aspecto da esperança, né, de que ainda dá tempo de fazer as coisas. A senhora comenta no prefácio do seu livro, e já comentou aqui hoje, comparando o comportamento humano coletivo que permitiu que a gente sobrevivesse por um período no início da pandemia, antes que as vacinas tivessem acessíveis, né? E aí a senhora comenta como esse comportamento humano coletivo poderia ser um caminho para que as coisas funcionassem contra as mudanças climáticas. A minha pergunta, presidente Robinson, é a seguinte: esse comportamento humano coletivo que foi possível contra a Covid, ele era temporário, digamos assim, né? Que todo mundo ficar em casa, todo mundo respeitar distanciamento social. Ele tinha uma data marcada e ele causou uma exaustão. Num determinado momento, as pessoas tinham cansado desse comportamento coletivo. Quando a gente pensa no longo prazo das mudanças climáticas e no quanto o problema é difuso e complexo, de fato é possível a gente pensar num comportamento humano coletivo que permita confrontar as mudanças climáticas, ou isso é muito ainda nesse campo da esperança, né? A gente tem que ser muito mais complexo do que isso.
I think the need for collective behavior is different in different regions for the reason that I gave, that element of climate justice, that, developing countries, we built our economy on fossil fuel, we have to wean ourselves off. We also have to wean ourselves off a throwaway society, a sort of spend now society, buying different brands and models and all the rest of it, all of that. We have to go back to a circular economy where nothing is wasted. I mean, I don't want to say back to, we have to go forward to, if you like, but we have to go back to some of the habits that I grew up with, that you mended clothes, that you sewed on buttons if they came off, you didn't just throw. And, I learned to darn, I learned to knit, and, my brothers, I had 4 brothers, they wore hand-me-down clothes, and, you didn't waste things. We didn't have bottled water. The idea of drinking bottled water in Ireland, was strange until everybody started doing it a few years ago. Now we're not doing it anymore. We're not using the single plastics. I'm based in Trinity in Dublin as a professor of climate justice. Trinity's gone very green. It's making every effort. And even in the buffet, the food is now mostly vegetarian or vegan. There are very few choices other than that to encourage students to get used to that food while they're in college and so on. It's kind of attempts to change behavior. That has to happen more in the industrialized world that benefited from fossil fuel and built up our economies. We're the rich parts of the world. We have to live well, but live more simply in a circular economy and with sustainable products.
Renata?
Presidente Robinson, eu gostaria de saber qual mensagem você gostaria de deixar para a geração de 2030 e 2050.
I believe that my generation completely failed, and that we know now that it's going to be the energy of the younger generation and the inventiveness and the entrepreneurship and hopefully the political involvement that's going to help us to make up for the time my generation lost and the fact that we would not take it seriously enough early enough. The elders link a lot with young people, and I find that a very encouraging dialogue, the intergenerational dialogue, because young people today are so smart, they're so digitally connected, they're entrepreneurial, and they are assertive of wanting to change to a better future. And they see it much more clearly, and they have a global sense of climate justice. They often, those who are from the developed world, speak about their, they often use even brothers and sisters, but they speak with love about those who are less well off, suffering the injustices, the indigenous peoples, and so on. And it's very heartening to see the kind of moral compass of these young people because they've become interested in the climate crisis. It has changed them somehow into being global citizens and caring about each other and caring about that world.
Bonito isso. E com isso, então, a gente encerra esse quarto bloco, vai para mais uma interrupção e volta já já com o encerramento do nosso Roda Viva de hoje.
Bradesco, transforme o futuro.
Estamos de volta com o Roda Viva, que hoje recebe a ex-comissária da ONU para o Clima e ex-presidente da Irlanda, Mary Robinson. Presidente Robinson, nesta COP não serão firmados novos compromissos, né? O que vai se tentar é acelerar e comprometer os países com os compromissos de Paris. Que mecanismos efetivos vão ser colocados à mesa para que a gente possa auferir o quanto cada país está cumprindo daquilo com o que se comprometeu?
It is possible now to assess how countries are meeting their commitments. We know at the moment that if everybody did what they promised at the Paris Agreement, and implemented fully what they promised, and countries are not implementing fully at the moment, we would have a world of 2.7 degrees warming. So, it is possible to calculate, and Carbon Tracker and other ways of doing it are able to tell us where we are. I know that during Paris, and actually after the G20, we will get an assessment of how close to being on track for a 1.5 degree world, and we won't be near. And that's the point I'm making, that we're going to have to see that there's a gap, that we have to have a process to fill, a political roadmap to fill, a commitment, not every 5 years raising ambition, not waiting for the stock taking in 2023, but having a real way of ensuring that countries will be under pressure constantly to increase their ambition, and that companies will be under pressure to get out of coal and oil and gas, and etc. And that countries that are of the rich world who promised the 100 billion will be under pressure, not just to get 100 billion in the years 23, 24, 25, but more than that, because they failed in 2020 and may not reach it for 2021 at COP. I mean, there's a big effort now to try to make sure we reach the 100 billion. We may not quite reach it. We're pretty close, but we may not close it. And so, it's accountability we have to build into the system. It's not there enough, but we have ways of doing it, because the science has improved to the extent that we are able to predict things. And there have been breakthroughs on, for example, methane. It has become a serious agreement between a large number of states that there's a quick fix of how to reduce emissions by taking the methane reduction in 3 areas where it's predominant, in waste, in fossil fuel, particularly in fracking and flaring of oil and gas, and then thirdly in agriculture. So there'll be much more pressure. But the point about it is methane is more serious than carbon, but for a shorter time. But if we can stop the methane, it will help us to stay aligned more with the 1.5 degrees. And that has been one of the good news stories recently.
Leonardo.
Presidente Robinson, de acordo com as Nações Unidas, o mundo tem cerca de 40 milhões de pessoas submetidas a formas contemporâneas de escravidão. No Brasil, atividades econômicas que utilizam trabalho escravo também são grandes emissoras de gases de efeito estufa ou contribuem com a destruição do meio ambiente, como o desmatamento, a pecuária, o garimpo e a produção de carvão vegetal. Em todo o mundo há um ciclo bastante vicioso, em que escravizados destroem florestas e aí contribuem com mudanças climáticas que levam a seca, inundação, desertificação, que aumenta a vulnerabilidade social e que, por sua vez, aumenta o trabalho escravo. Como quebrar esse ciclo?
I think it is good to link human trafficking with the issues of climate. Actually, it's really good to get out of silos of thinking that things are dealt with separately. They're very often linked. And, what COVID has brought out is the intersectionality, in particular of, the racist, the injustice of racism, the injustice of gender discrimination, the injustice of poverty, the injustice of human trafficking, etc. There's an intersectionality in that if you're very poor and in a very poor job where you're basically being trafficked, you're a human slave as we now characterize because of the conditions. You may be, there are quite a number of people in India in particular and Pakistan that are almost owned by the owner in the sense they don't have any independent rights and they can't negotiate, they can't do anything. Abuse of labour is a very, very real problem in our world. And you're right to say, and very often it's by those who exploit abusing labour to make more profit, to make themselves richer, and very often producing more emissions.
Presidente, a crise climática, no seu livro, a senhora afirma que a crise climática é um problema provocado por homens e que a solução agora é uma questão feminista. Por que é tão importante ouvir as mulheres para a solução da crise climática?
Well, first of all, I do say we need a feminist solution, and that doesn't exclude men. In fact, I hope it will be embraced by as many men as possible. More men are calling themselves feminists, as you probably know, but they tend to be men if they're presidents or prime ministers who have cabinets that are balanced, 50% women and men, because that's part of, that we need the equality and the parity at all the tables of women and men for better decisions. But it is true that women, on the whole, have a way of leading which helps deal with the climate crisis. And we've seen that women-led governments have by and large done better with COVID for the same reason, because it's a collaborative problem-solving way of leading. It's consultative. There's less ego. It's less, macho in that sense. And it does care about those you govern. You see leadership as service to the people. It's a servant leadership very often. And I think that's very helpful. And I note, and I'm very much involved in a number of women leaders networks. And I see a lot of trust among women leaders because actually we got to where we've got to because we believe passionately in change that needs to happen. And therefore there's a trust that, we know we're on the same side in these issues. So some of these women leaders networks are becoming quite effective in looking for change. And before Paris, there was a network of us women with Laurence Toubiana, with Christiana Figueres and others. Some of them were called lionesses, but we were part of a network that was supportive of Paris being achieved. And, I think in this century, women are going to have to play much more of a role, including young women, including Greta Thunberg and her generation, many of whom are the young climate activists who speak out, Shea Bastida and many others.
Cláudio?
Eu queria fazer uma pergunta sobre comportamento do setor privado. A gente tem ouvido ultimamente muita gente falando de ESG, mas a lógica das empresas, em especial das empresas de combustíveis fósseis, parece não estar mudando muito. A Shell, por exemplo, recentemente sugeriu que se resolva o problema das emissões plantando florestas em países em desenvolvimento como o Brasil. Eu queria saber da senhora em que medida o ESG não seria a nova roupagem do velho negacionismo climático.
I can understand very much the question, and I'm very critical of some offsetting that's going on. As you say, planting, and I've seen, there was a project of my university, Trinity College Dublin, in Senegal, a PhD and some masters in development practice who were studying mangroves with the community. And it was a very good project, but they watched projects in the area they were in where 1,000 trees were being planted on bad land. Nobody cared about the trees. It was just offsetting, and they got money for it. The trees would die and another 1,000 trees would be planted. Absolutely outrageous. And there's a lot of that going on. And that's greenwashing, and it's undermining. You know, the point about ESG, paying more attention to environment, to social, meaning labour standards, safety of protection of workers, etc., collective bargaining, and then governance. You know, a board that is balanced in many ways, both racially and gender ways, and so on. All of this is good for companies. And like anything else, it can be abused, it can be exploited, it can be superficial. But some countries take it seriously. What I was pointing out in Paul Pullman's book about net positive, he's saying on behalf of Unilever, which he led for a long number of years, he uses that example. Actually, things are so serious now, ESG is not enough. Trying to be sustainable within your company is not enough. You've got to go that extra step and be net positive, regenerate, do more than you need to do, because the world needs it and your company will benefit from it.
Renata?
Presidente Robson, de todos os países que a senhora conheceu no mundo, né, vendo todas as diferentes culturas, né, os diferentes povos e realidades desses países, quais você lembra que teria ali uma justiça climática, o que mais se aproximaria de uma justiça climática? Que lugares do mundo você viu o que mais se aproximaria disso?
Yeah, you know, it's a hard question in many ways. I think if I was to pick one country, it would be Costa Rica. You know, it is almost completely dependent now on clean energy. Sometimes if the wind isn't blowing, there might be a problem, or you know, but basically it's pretty well got there. It's been on the right side of a lot of human rights issues, and you know, the issues that will be progressive in the Human Rights Council or in the UN or whatever. And, you know, I've only visited it once, I must confess, but it's a beautiful country. And it's sort of, it's a small country like my own country, Ireland, but it seems to capture the biodiversity of the world in a wonderful way. And I think that may affect people. It's also a country that doesn't have an army, you know, all the things that, you know, are good models for how the world could be a much better place.
Giovana, para a última do programa.
Já que é a última pergunta, eu vou voltar numa provocação, então. A Cristina tinha perguntado mais cedo o que a senhora diria se a senhora encontrasse frente a frente o presidente Bolsonaro, e a senhora falou da preocupação com a Amazônia. Eu imagino que a resposta dele ia ser: mas os países da Europa todos desmataram e agora eles estão cobrando que a gente proteja a floresta. Como que a senhora responderia isso para ele?
I would say yes, we did foolishly deforest, including Ireland. And we are now conscious of having to bring up our forest cover and do it appropriately with the proper, you know, native trees mainly, and not and think about it very seriously and link it in with other nature-based solutions. But it's not really an answer, because the Amazon actually is a sort of, it's one of the huge lungs of the world. It matters to the whole world. It matters to the future of our children and grandchildren. And that's different from what individual countries may have done in their foolishness in the past that they're now trying to make up for.
Com esse recado, então, chega ao fim o nosso programa. Eu agradeço muitíssimo a presidente Mary Robinson por essa entrevista tão esclarecedora, bem como a bancada que me acompanhou aqui hoje, a Cristina Serra, Renata Tupinambá, Leonardo Sakamoto, Giovana Girardi, Cláudio Ângelo e o nosso Paulo Caruso. Agradeço sobretudo a você pela sua audiência. Mesmo que a COP26 tenha sucesso em antecipar metas e compromissos dos governos, eles só serão efetivos para mitigar os efeitos da elevação das temperaturas sobre a vida na Terra se todos nós adotarmos mudanças no nosso estilo de vida, mudanças essas igualmente radicais. A humanidade já se mostrou capaz de promover revoluções tecnológicas para acelerar o progresso. Agora é preciso usar esse engenho para frear o termostato e possibilitar que o planeta continue existindo para as nossas futuras gerações. A TV Cultura fará uma cobertura intensiva da COP26, que, como eu disse, começa no próximo dia 31. Você fica agora com o Senhor Brasil e o Roda Viva volta na próxima segunda-feira, às 10 da noite. Até lá!
Bradesco. Transforme o futuro.